Hello, everyone at Classical Archives. I'm Barry Lenson. I'm editor-in-chief for Classical Archives, and today I have the considerable honor and privilege of speaking with Maestro Jindong Cai, a leading conductor internationally who would like to speak with us about multicultural aspects of music and music performance and the history of the relationship between Western and Eastern music, and a lot of really fascinating topics. So I'm very excited to have the opportunity to do this and to share this interview with you on Classical Archives. So I'm afraid that I'm going to look down and read an introduction that I have for Maestro Cai, and then I will shed my glasses after I read that. Okay. Conductor Jindong Cai is director of the U.S.-China Music Institute, professor of music and arts at Bard College, and associate conductor of the Orchestra Now. During his 30-plus year career in the United States, Maestro Cai has established himself as an active and dynamic conductor, a scholar of Western classical music in China, and a leading advocate of music from across Asia. Born in Beijing, he received his early musical training in China, where he learned to play both the violin and the piano. He came to the United States to do graduate studies at the prestigious New England Conservatory and the College-Conservatory of Music in Cincinnati. In 1989, he was selected to study with Leonard Bernstein at the Tanglewood Music Center, and he also won the Conducting Fellowship Award at the Aspen Music Festival in 1990 and 1992. Maestro Cai started his professional conducting career with the Cincinnati Symphony Orchestra and has worked with numerous orchestras throughout North America and Asia. He maintains strong ties to his homeland and has conducted most of the top orchestras in China. He has also served as the principal guest conductor of the China's Shenzhen Symphony Orchestra since 2012. He's a three-time recipient of the ASCAP Award for Adventurous Programming of Contemporary Music. He serves as the principal guest conductor of the Mongolia State Academic Theater of Opera and Ballet in Ulaanbaatar. In 2004, he joined Stanford University's faculty as Director of Orchestral Studies and conducted the Stanford Symphony Orchestra for 11 years. He is also the founder of the Stanford Pan-Asian Music Festival. He founded the U.S.-China Music Institute at the Bard Conservatory of Music in 2017 and is accomplishing great things there. He created the Institute's annual China Now Music Festival the following year. In its first few seasons, China Now presented new works by some of the most important Chinese composers of our time, with concerts performed at Lincoln Center, Carnegie Hall, Bard's Fisher Center, and also at Stanford University. Together with his wife, Sheila Melvin, he has co-authored many articles on the performing arts in China, and also the book Rhapsody in Red, How Western Classical Music Became Chinese. Their latest book, Beethoven in China, How the Great Composer Became an Icon in the People's Republic, was published by Penguin in September 2015. Also, let me just mention that if you were lucky enough to see the recent re-airing of the documentary Beethoven in Beijing, which was aired recently on PBS, that was co-produced by Maestro Cai. You're privileged to see some of the ongoing involvements in bringing Western classical music to China. So that is my introduction, which certainly adds a lot of credibility to the fact that we're very honored to have Maestro Cai with us today. So I have some questions, but I would encourage him to reject questions, expand questions, take questions in whatever direction he would like to move them in. So may I start by asking about the U.S.-China Music Institute when it was founded and what its goals and plans are.
Okay, thank you, Barry. That's very kind of you for the introduction. And, over 30 years in the United States, I definitely think the musical exchange between US and China, it's a very, very important for our general relationship. And for the US-China Music Institute, we created this organization in 2017. And before that, then my dear friend, Bob Martin, who was the director of Bard Conservatory, and we were talking about how we can, exploring Chinese music to the Western audience and to the West world for quite some years. He often traveled to China, the Bard Conservatory orchestra visit China, and so on. So, and in the end, we found some funding. Then we just say, there's no better way to really start an institution and devote the institution itself to do the mission. So that's how we started US-China Music Institute at Bard College. And also, when Bob and I, each time we come back to China, visit China, we visit conservatories, we visit, the music schools around China, and we want to go to performances. You will see in Chinese conservatories, there are so many talented students playing Western music, Western instruments, right? They're great pianists and they're great violinists, cellists, or so on. And the level is just incredibly high. But at the same time, and you will see just as talented students play Chinese instruments like erhu, pipa, or Chinese composition, or so on, right? But that part of the world we don't really see in the West. So that's what I think, what we think it's really the Chinese music is really its own music developed in that level. I think it's ready to let the world to know. So that's another reason, and of course, between US and China, the musical relationship has been flourishing for all those years. And we can talk about it later. So start from 1973, the first American orchestra visit China, the Philadelphia Orchestra visit China. From there on, and the cultural exchange, the music exchange between those two countries have been nonstop and only getting better. And it's really, so myself is one of the product of this relationship. And also, and there are many musicians like me, stayed in America. You can find the Chinese musicians in every single symphony orchestra, every single opera houses, every single conservatories, teaching and learning. And so that's what you see the impact of the classical music in China, right? At the same time, many people studied in the West actually went back to China. So then went back to China and from Europe, from America, and they create orchestras, they compose for Chinese orchestras, and it's just as, flourishing as the musicians, the Chinese musicians in this country. So I think that really is, really gave us hope for the future. And for the future, not only the relationship between the United States and China through music, but also for classical music's future. So that's how we, the purpose for us to create this US-China Music Institute. Our mission is to introduce music from contemporary China to the Western audience. And at the same time, to promote cultural exchange between those musical exchange between those two countries. And since we started this organization, we have several things we did to accomplish that mission. And one is, for example, we create a degree program for Chinese music. So if you study Chinese instruments, you can come to Bard, just like you study violin or piano. And we list them as one of the instruments, so you can learn that. And the teachers are all come from Central Conservatory of Music in Beijing, which is really the best conservatories in China. And they send teachers here, and also we do online teaching. And so that has been really going really well. And so the idea of this is a twofold. One is we have a place in the West. People want to learn Chinese music, you can come to study, you can come to learn, right? This is the one thing. And another purpose is, for the first few years, we will say most of the students actually will come from China, because they have been learning the Chinese instrument from they were young, just like the violinist and pianist. So for those students, before the institute, and they never had chance to come to West to have a liberal arts education. So what we provide is to give them, on one hand, they can continue to study traditional Chinese music and Chinese instrument, and at the same time, they get a modern American liberal arts education. So I hope that when they graduate, when they grow up, you will create a new generation of Chinese musicians. Those musicians not only equipped with Chinese traditional music technique or music, but also had a world view. So I think that will help music development in China, at the same time to help the music development in the West. So that is the great program. Then we also create the festival. It's called China Now Music Festival. So we already did 3, every year we did once, and we do it 3 years and consecutive years. So the purpose for that is to create a platform to introduce music from contemporary China. We commission the new compositions, and also we try to combine Western music and the Western instrument and Chinese instrument together to perform at new compositions as well. And so it really has been also going on really, really well. For example, in 2019, right, we commissioned a big oratorial piece that including orchestra, chorus, and solos, and to commemorate the the American transcontinental railroad.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's and so the transcontinental railroad, and it's 150 years ago. That's defined to make America to become modern, between the West and East, they connected. And so that, and on the west part, from Utah until Sacramento, this part of the railroad mostly built by Chinese railroad workers. Yeah, yes. It's nearly 20,000 Chinese workers came from China to build this the railroad. So that part of history, and people know a little bit, but really not that much. So we decided to bring that onto musical stage. So that's what we did. We had we invited the very, very wonderful composer Zhou Long to write music. We also invited a Yale professor to write the lyrics, and the performance, premiere performance was in 2019 in Carnegie Hall. Then we bring the force came to Stanford to perform. And so that's really, that kind of thing we want to do, and is to really exploring the whole new music world, from the tradition to the contemporary. So in the traditional side, you can see the classical music has been flourishing for many years. You see Lang, Li Yundi, and Wang Yujia, and many of those superstars, right? But they are playing Western music. Yeah, so you can see the level they achieved on Western music is remarkable. But at the same time, I will say Chinese music world is really vibrating to create something new to the classical music. And some people always ask me to say, do you think, in the 21st century, China will save the classical music? I will say, the classical music in the 20th century, it's a really, we should looking forward, and we should see how this classical music can continue for more generations. And in this process, China will contribute great deal. So that's there's several reasons, and we created a U.S.-China Music Institute to make the East and West know each other better through music, and also to join force for the classical music in the 21st century.
Well, that's wonderful, very ambitious and very wonderful.
Thank you.
So congratulations.
Thank you. Yeah.
I also wanted to ask you a little bit about history of the relationship of Eastern and Western music, because I have to admit that I have, for my entire life, had an incorrect series of assumptions about the relationship between Eastern and Western musicians and music. My assumption was that, and I guess I derived this by working in an American Music Conservatory, that musicians came to the United States from China, learned Western musical forms and Western instruments, and then went back to China, and that was somehow the gestational force that led to the growth of Western music and the appreciation of Western music in China and Asia generally. But when we spoke last week, I realized that those assumptions were really completely wrong on my part. A typical Western-centric perspective on my part, because the history of Western ensembles and Western music in China goes back far, far longer, right? You were in city of Shanghai and orchestras, Western orchestras there. So I wonder if I can ask you to tell me again and tell us about some of that history.
Yeah, history went back a long way. And in the book my wife and I wrote, Bernstein read, we really went back to look at the history, how Western music came to China and how it take roots in China and how to further developed. And we kind of make a decisive decision to say, okay, let's start from 1601. The 1601 is the year a missionary, Matteo Ricci, and came to China and met the emperor, then was the Ming Dynasty emperor, and to present him with a keyboard instrument, the clavichord. And the clavichord is a little wooden box, and the keyboard instrument, right? It's easier to carry. It's not like a harpsichord later becomes so big. So it's easy to carry, and you open the box, you play. So is the first, we'll say, Western classical music came to China, and but the mission really not for music at all, right? And because the missionary came to China because they really want to convert Chinese to Christianity, right. And so the Jesuits, they were sent by the Pope to the east. And first, they went to like Father San Francis, they went to Japan and tried to convert Japanese. And then they found out the Japanese are only doing what the Chinese doing. So they really didn't take it very seriously. So they said, if we want to develop in the East, we need to go to China. So that's how they tried many times, many years to go to China, and was not very successful because China really closed the door. They never even let them to be in. And they stuck in Macau. That's far as they can go. They can look across the water. They see China, but they cannot get in. But not until Matteo Ricci, he is a Jesuit. He sent by the Pope to there. But what he did, he make himself to be more Chinese. So he learned the language. He dressed like Confucius scholars, and he making friends with Chinese people. So that made a huge difference. And then they let him in. And I even introduced him step by step from Macau. In the end, he went to Beijing to see the emperor. So that's what it changed. So he arrived in 1601 in Beijing. Then the Ming emperor, the emperors had been interested West for a long time, especially Western, this kind of a scientific development, astronomy and mechanism and probably maybe music, right? So they always like this very delicate clock and or some special instruments. So that's what the Jesuits, and realized that they bring that to the emperor. The emperor liked it, especially emperor liked this clavichord. So then to start to play for the emperor. So from there on, and the emperor from Ming Dynasty and later in the Qing Dynasty, they consistently asked the Pope to send more musicians to the Forbidden City.
Okay.
Yeah. So those are, there's many interesting stories. Like there's an Italian Jesuit. He was sent to China. He was a musician. Pedrini, that's his name, and he supposedly to see the Qing emperor in China. And then he tried to get on the boat from Portuguese port, but he went there late, so missed the boat. So then he took a different boat, and the boat took him to South America, not in China. But he determined to go to China. He got another boat, and somehow through many, turmoils or many difficulties, he get into Philippines. And from Philippines, he actually piloted his own boat, went to Macau, and from Macau, he went to China. So by the time he left Europe and arrived in Beijing, it took him 10 years to get there.
Wow.
Yeah.
And this was about what, I think you said, well, this was about what year, approximately what year was this?
This is the early 17th century, I would say. Yeah. So anyway, so he, the mid 17th century. Yeah. So then, he he arrived in Beijing and the same day, and the emperor said, come to the Forbidden City. So he immediately came there, and he started to teach, not only play the music, but also teach them and teach the Forbidden City people, like eunuchs or some children of the emperor, and to learn Western music. And so even today, if you go to the Beijing library, you can dig out those textbook he wrote.
Wow.
Yeah, it's really, you see the Western notation, the interval, those kind of a theory, music theory, and so on. So it's a really fascinating story. And also you can see, Jesuits, when they devote themselves for a mission you're supposed to do. Doesn't matter how many years they go there. And most of those missionaries, they know when they came to China, they may never go back to Europe. And the emperor, the Chinese emperor, also accepted them to say, okay, you can be in Beijing. We'll give you a piece of land to have a church, but probably you will never live here. So many of those Jesuits died in China, and even today you can visit their tomb. Basically, there's a graveyard about them. So anyway, so this is the tradition of how Western music came to China the first place, right? But it really didn't go beyond the Forbidden City. It's a Western music more like the emperor's toy, or a curiosity, out of curiosity, want to learn. And so like this Joshua played on the clavichord, harpsichord. He taught the eunuch to play on harpsichord. And the eunuch played a Chinese song. Then he came on to repeat that song. That made the emperor very, very fascinated to say, how can you repeat a Chinese song? And then because of notation, because that way of learning Western music. So that is the first, I would say, stage of Western music came to China. But the really development of the Western music in China will be in the not until early 20th century or late 19th century. Yeah, and we all know this historical event took place in 1840. It's called Opium War. Mm-hmm. And the Opium War basically is British and Western powers, they really condemned China for not letting them to do business in China. But the most reason, because they want to get into Chinese market, just like today somehow, because the European had, after the Industrial Revolution, has been really booming, and they see China is actually a market, and that China has been keep them out. So that's what they and throughout the years they tried. And the Macartney expedition, they sent the entourage to go to celebrate the Chinese emperor's 80th birthday. And they gave lots of gifts to the emperor, basically want them to open China to them. And then the Emperor Qianlong said, you barbarians, and he wrote a letter to King George to say, we don't need you. We are the center of the world. So that's how they stopped the Western come to China. Then the Western powers start to come in China a different way, which is selling opium and through India to China, and that really to made the Chinese society dysfunctioning. Throughout years, the people become addicted from the top officials until the regular people, and whatever the money they earn from the Europe, they all went back to Europe because of opium. So that's and the Chinese government finally they want to stop this and burned opium and killed a couple of those Western merchants. That triggered Opium War, right? So after the Opium War, but China was very weak, so they lost the war, and both Opium Wars they lost it, and then when you lost the war, that back then you have to pay money or you have to give the land. So one of the conditions is that they have to open the port cities. And Shanghai is one of the port cities they opened to the Western merchants. So from 1840, 1850, and then Shanghai become booming for the Western to do business in China. And that's how really developed. And by the early 20th century, Shanghai is really a very prosperous place for many Western to come. And they want to have their own music. They want to have their own cultural. So there's Shakespeare, there's classical music, and as a matter of fact, the Shanghai, the first symphony orchestra created in China, the Shanghai Public Band, was in 1879, which is really like a couple years older than the Boston Symphony or some other major American orchestras. But the orchestras created in about 20 people, 20 musicians from Philippines or from Europe, and there's now Chinese musicians in it. And so that's how they started. And also they exclusively play Western music and for Western audience. Chinese audience even cannot be in the concerts. So that's what is the another wave of Western music developed in China, and from the early 20th century. And from there on, this wave had been nonstop. And so there's by then there are many Chinese went to Europe, study music, and came back to China. And then in 1927, and this Chinese musician Xiao Youmei, he studied in Leipzig, and he went back to China, say we need to reform our music, and we need to learn from German, from the Europeans, is how music take an important role in the society. So he tried something in Beijing, didn't work, because Beijing is it's a warlord controlled territory, and so then he went to the south. He found out Shanghai actually had this wonderful symphony orchestra, and then he found out this Shanghai, there are lots of young people want to learn Western music. So in 1927, he created first conservatory in China, the Shanghai Conservatory. And because of that conservatory, and many young people around China, whoever want to learn Western music, came to Shanghai. So that conservatory is pretty much, nurtured the first generation of Chinese musicians study Western music. So that's a little history, 400 something years history. We just went through in like 10 minutes, but definitely I would say Chinese Western music take roots in China a long time ago, but the most developed period is from end of 19th century and early 20th century.
Boy, that's fabulous. Thank you so much. My head is spinning. I think this interview is going to serve as a wonderful resource for so many people who want to understand this. I mean, I certainly never understood even one little tiny percentage of all this. So thank you.
Yeah, and I mean in the 20th century, from I would say from 1920 until 1940. So that is really the best time classical music developed in China. It's the best time historically, because there's lots of musicians came to Shanghai. First of all, there are lots of musicians came to Shanghai. And like, for example, after 1917, the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, there are lots of Russian musicians. They escaped that revolution, came to Harbin, which is a northern city in China, and they created a conservatory. And many of them actually later came inland to Shanghai. And so those Russian musicians in Shanghai, they really had a profound influence on Chinese music, the classical music development. They taught a lot of Chinese musicians, young kids, to learn piano, string instruments, and to be taught, in the conservatory especially. And then in 1930s, during this, it's about just Second World War, right? There are lots of Jewish people, Jewish musicians. They escaped Europe. They can come to Shanghai, to China. So that's and Shanghai was the only port city around the world. Actually, you don't need a visa, and you don't even need passport. If you have a ticket, a boat ticket to go to Shanghai, you are allowed to leave Europe and you are allowed to enter in China. So because of that, there's so many refugees, especially Jewish refugees, came to Shanghai, and there's many of them are musicians, excellent musicians. There are musicians of Berlin Philharmonic, there were musicians of Vienna, Philharmonic, or so on, and opera houses. So those people came to Shanghai. So the Shanghai in 1920s, 1930s, the orchestra, back then it's called Shanghai Municipal Orchestra, was the best orchestra in Asia, in Far East. And Japan developed the Western culture much earlier, but they never had the orchestra like that, because most of their orchestras are created by Japanese musicians. But this orchestra in Shanghai actually is mostly European, Russian, and so on. Not until 1927. And before 1927, there were not Chinese musicians. Only in 1927, the Italian conductor Mario Pacci, he insisted, he said, I really want Chinese musicians to play in the orchestra. I want the Chinese audience, and Chinese to be in the audience. So from there on, they, from 1925, they start to have a Chinese audience in the concert hall. In 1927, he made the first Chinese violinist to play in the orchestra. So it's another part of the history. You can see Chinese involved with classical music development in China from 1920s. So, and like you said, history actually, it's fascinating. This part of history is really fascinating. And I hope we have more time to explore it, but I can give you this general picture from 1601 until end of the 19th century and early first half of the 20th century. That pretty much, and by 1940, classical music take roots in China. You have your own musician, you have your own conservatory, you have your own orchestra. So that's it's pretty settled there. And after the People's Republic of China, 1949, that's when the communists controlled the country. They had initial debate and in the circle to say, do we really want this Western music, decadent, or from the capitalists, we want that or not? And there's some people say, no, we don't really need them. But the leaders, some of the leaders back then, like Premier Zhou Enlai and Shanghai Mayor Chen Yi, those two people specifically, they have studied in France. So they kind of know Western culture. They said, we should have it, because this is a very good tool for the cultural development. So that's the Shanghai Municipal Orchestra survived, and also they basically become more Chinese. Yeah. So then in Beijing, and of course from 1950s, and China get big support from the Soviet Union, and because they were brothers, right? They were communist brothers. Yeah. So basically, and the whole 1950s, and China sent hundreds, thousands of young people to go to Soviet Union to study science, culture, and music. And so there's some famous classical music conductors, musicians in that generation, basically trained by Russians. Yeah, so that's another part of that. And also Russia also helped China in 1950s to build the ballet theaters, opera houses, and music schools and symphony orchestras. So that's it's a institutionalized classical music and classical arts in China. So that's the 1950s, right? And of course, in 1960s, from 1966 to 1976, that's a big 10 years of turmoil in China. We call it Cultural Revolution, right? So during the Cultural Revolution, all Western music were forbidden. So anything old, anything foreign actually was forbidden. It's not only Western music, but some classical Chinese arts also become forbidden. And the one of the reason is because of Mao, he believed he can create a new society, and he believed the old arts will really corrupt the society. Yeah, so that's why he wanted to create something new. To destroy old is not only his purpose. The purpose is for him to create something new, to representing the majority of the masses. Yeah, so that's in his mind. He see arts and culture, including music, as very important tool for political propaganda. In 1940, and even before the People's Republic of China was established, he gave a talk to all the arts workers in Yan'an to say, arts had to serve the politics. And so that's the one important message. And second important message to say, because art have to serve the politics, and then the current politics is back then was against Japanese invasion, but also it's basically to how artists can represent the masses. The masses, the 90% of the masses will be workers, peasants, soldiers. And so that for artists, if you want to represent them, then you have to go to them. You have to learn from them. And then you come back to compose and then present artwork for them. So it's a kind of a message Mao gave to art workers. And I think even today, that still influence on development of Chinese art and music. Yeah, so that's and so we talk about the Cultural Revolution. It went to extreme, right? So foreign music were forbidden, but what they did instead is to create it's called the model operas, and there are only 8 model operas, that including symphony. But so which means even Peking opera or symphony or ballet, they all use Western symphony orchestra format. They use Western instrument, use Western composition, but they presenting a revolutionary theme. Yeah, so you have to have a heroic figure on the top, and then so everything is become revolutionary for the revolution purpose. That's during the Cultural Revolution. And I grew up during the Cultural Revolution. I learned those model operas pretty much. That's how I started to play the violin. You were not too allowed to play Mozart, Beethoven, but you're allowed to play etudes and revolutionary songs. So that I learned violin by just play those revolution dances or songs. And that's you do have to say, during the Cultural Revolution, those model operas, they put so much energy in it. They collect most those probably experienced composers or artists to work on it and become sort of classics even today. It's a classics of a different kind, of course, but those are I would say have some influence on Chinese music development. Yeah, after the Cultural Revolution, everything is free, right? And everything in the 80s and was so open, and we want to learn from the West. We invite Western musicians, orchestras to come to teach, perform, and I become very fascinated, by conducting, for example. Yeah, so and I was in 1979, I was a freshman in music school in college. And that year, the Vienna Philharmonic came, Berlin Philharmonic came with Carillon, and the Vienna Philharmonic came with Abado, and then Boston Symphony came with C.G. Ozawa. So those are, as a young freshman music school, you want to absorb everything. I went to every single rehearsal as possible, every single performance possible. And it still have a profound influence on my career. When you look at the Carillon to conduct the Berlin Philharmonic in this actually Coliseum, because there were not concert halls in China. So they have to build a Coliseum with a music shell and they perform. And, he stand there, barely move, and with his eye closed, but the orchestra sound came out, you just unbelievable, just make you feel like, wow, I never heard music like that, so that's really struck me very, very profoundly. And then when you look at C.G. Ozawa, conduct about symphony, C.G. Ozawa is a complete opposite than Carillon. He moved every part of his body.
Yes.
Yeah, and it's again, the orchestra came out sound just as colorful as what he want to be. He showed and indicated, and those two conductors, it really had a profound influence on me. I want to be a composer, but at the same time, I just feel like, wow, I want to be a conductor. And I want to be conductor and like them, and I want to go to West to study conducting. So I think I'm not the only one. There's Tan Dun, Chen Yi, Zhou Long, all the same generation musicians that we were growing up. Pretty much the adult musical life start from after the Cultural Revolution, and we all came to the West, and we all studied in those wonderful, famous conservatories or music schools, or studied with musicians, and many of them really settled here to become, a front runner of classical music, like Tan Dun, right? It's a pretty much, it's not really backseat composer anymore. It's like a front runner of contemporary classical music in general.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. At one point I was reading about you, and I read that you had said at one point that Beethoven and Mahler were great influences on just increasing general love of classical music. Do you feel that that's true? Also, I want to ask you, during the Cultural Revolution, was anybody in China playing Shostakovich? Or was Shostakovich?
No, I don't. During the Revolution, anything is Western is forbidden. Even and Soviet Union back then is not anymore China's brothers anymore. It's
Right.
After Khrushchev, basically they broke up. They broke up that music. They don't have that exchange either. And also Shostakovich was sensitive figure in Soviet Union. How
Yes.
that can be in communist China? It's not possible. But I will say, and throughout this kind of a Western music development in China, there are a couple of composers really stand out, more accepted by Chinese people than many other composers. One is Beethoven. And I will say the second one, maybe not Mahler until the recent years. Traditionally, I would say the second composer was really very well known in China. It's Chopin.
Okay.
Yeah, so those are two composers. For Beethoven, I think there's a reason somehow his life, his composition, and just so clicked with Chinese people. He was introduced to China in 1905, 1906. Back then, Chinese people never really heard Beethoven's music because there was not really Chinese orchestra or pianist or anything. So he was introduced to China. Really, it's about writing about his life. Yeah, so there was a little called music magazine called Little Music Magazine actually, and wrote a short biography about 300 words about him to say this musician in Europe, and his life went through the difficulties, obstacles. His father was drunk, and his nephew treated him badly, and his love life didn't go anywhere, and he cannot hear. But yeah, but he produced great music. All European people admire him, and he become a symbol of this, the highest art and classical music. So that was how Beethoven was introduced to China first, and so Chinese people, when we were young, the people, especially during that time, China itself is in turmoil. It's really poor, and so the young generation of people were being told by their parents or by the society itself is to say, you have to once go through turmoil, you have to go through difficulties to be triumph. Yeah, so Beethoven, it just become that kind of example, and so that's what a Beethoven become idol of many Chinese young musicians, and as a humanity figure. It's not a musicians first. So after that, they start to hear his music, and then really Beethoven's image already set in the Chinese society. Yeah, I think for Chopin, it's pretty much from 1930, 1940, especially after 1950. It takes roots in China, also becomes his this nationalistic, this romantic feeling of this belonging. He grew up in Russia, in Poland, but then he had to go to France. But while he was in France, he created this beautiful piano music. And also same time, his heart always in Poland, right? So that's kind of a nostalgic or what do you call sentiment. It's really also clicked with Chinese people's mentality that end. So the two composers, Chopin and Beethoven, and even today, I would say the best known Western classical music composers. And the symphony orchestra play his music in their, Beethoven music all the time, and the Chinese pianists interpret Chopin probably the most sensitive, most really as a wonderful, pianists to interpret Chopin's music.
Yeah, absolutely true. Absolutely true.
Mahler is later on, in the past for 20 years, when before 20 years ago, nobody really, not the orchestra really can play Mahler. But in the past 20 years, China orchestral world have been changed dramatically. And first of all, you can see in the past 20 years how government really push to have cultural in the society. And what they can do is they build many concert halls, opera houses, and all those are state of arts. It's the best than anywhere in the world. So those are new concert halls, new opera houses. What they want to do is it's a kind of a fit into Chinese culture, because historically Chinese rulers always want to be also known by their poets or their musicians. You have to be a fuller person. And in the old days and Confucius time, and literati, as a good literati, you have to know poetry, you have to know the calligraphy, you have to know how to play the Chinese instrument called guqin, and you have to be reciting poem at the same time. You're good rulers. So that tradition has been pretty much also deeply rooted in Chinese society. And the modern leaders also want to be labeled that they're cultural leaders. So what they can do, they can, the government use government money to build concert halls. And because the concert halls, the opera house is it's the thing you can see. Look at this leader. He really want to do cultural. He built this concert halls. And after that, that wave has been continuing 20 years ago and still continue, start with Beijing, Shanghai, major cities to build those beautiful opera houses. And then now even the secondary cities, third level city, they start to build that concert, those facilities. And at the same time, after you build this facility, you have to have content, right? So many of those cities, they start to build their own orchestra, to build their own opera house. Basically, it's a human resources. Artists become more important. And in the past decade, the Chinese professional orchestra have been, skyrocketing from 50 professional orchestras now near 100. Professional orchestras. So they, because they have place to play, and they also they have musicians. The Chinese Conservatory built, have been producing many musicians, and also the many musicians went to the West, went back to China. So those musicians kind of a wave and helped to build those the content. The symphony orchestras and operas, it started flourishing. So that's it's a today's, if you talk about today's history, those are still going on. I think it's still going on, and you can every year there's new conservatories built. Then every year there's new symphony orchestra built. And so those are really quite fascinating to see.
Yeah, that's fabulous. So, we could talk another hour.
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
thanks to you, we could talk another hour. But I'm wondering, if I can ask, do you think that music has the potential to help establish human connections between people around the world, between people in Asia and the Western world? Do you feel that it's a good vehicle for understanding and affection?
I really believe that. Music. First of all, music really is. You don't need language to explain. It's a good music. You can feel it. It doesn't matter where you are, especially classical music. I think the contemporary the classical music scene, it's music, that kind of music, especially those from this great rich tradition of Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, Brahms, and to Buchner, Wagner, or Puccini, Verdi, and it's a world treasure. It's a world treasure. I don't think it's just belong to Italy or Germany or France anymore. It really belong to the whole world. And also this, the format, the art form, the opera art form, the orchestra art form, that even went further. It doesn't matter which country. You can play Vietnamese music with a symphony orchestra. You can play Chinese music with, opera with Chinese theme to create opera. So those are just become world music form, and anyone can create something on top of that. So I think, and just by that, you can see music can transcend, can really go beyond border, beyond language, beyond cultural, and to really bring people together, right? You can, and for example, in China, you play Beethoven, you play Shostakovich, Tchaikovsky for a while, but at the same time, composers writing new compositions of our time. Yeah, so I know this young composer, he grew up in China, so as a pianist, went to Juilliard to study composition, and then he already write 10 symphony orchestras, 10 symphonies. And and the Philadelphia Orchestra played one of his pieces a couple of years ago. And that was, in the movie you mentioned, Beethoven in Beijing. And so the classical music really it belongs to the New World. And because of that, I think, people want to continue to learn them. That doesn't matter where they are, right? So if you say, just talk about the US and China, we already talk a lot about those history, talk about my generation, how people stayed here and start to create like a Tan Dun, Chen Yi, Zhou Long composers start to create symphony orchestra pieces with Chinese characters, with Chinese elements. At the same time, many musicians went back to China. They probably also create a lot of Western influence pieces or something. So those are continue happening. And so that's, is another really, I think it's definitely the music can connect people, and music can really make people to understand each other better. If you have a chance, our audience have a chance to go to PBS to watch the Beethoven in Beijing documentary, you will see from 1973, when the Philadelphia Orchestra under Eugene Ormandy visited China for the first time, until 20 years later when they second time visited China. And then in 2011, when the Philadelphia Orchestra had financial difficulties and they have to, file for bankruptcy, and then they start to have a contract with China for 5 years. Every year they go to China, they actually making money in China. And so you can see, the connections between those two countries. It's you help each other, you try to understand each other. Actually, it's really all through the music activities. And I think that will continue. You think there's so many musicians graduate from Juilliard, from Bard Conservatory, and they're really active in China. Yeah, they're active in China, and the influence will be there. And at the same time, as I mentioned, people like us, we're in the United States, we're trying also to really promote the cultural exchange through music.
Yeah, so that's wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, that brings us to the end of an hour. Maybe we should schedule another conversation because this has been so fabulous.
I think so. Yeah, I think maybe, especially for our classical archive audience, and they are very focused on on the classical music and the core repertoire of classical music. And so I think this kind of a conversation will broaden their mind and to see, what's going on in our generation, in our century, and what's going to happen for classical music in the next century, next generation. I think that's a very, very important. And the world, as the world becomes so, intertwined, connected together, I think we also need to know beyond the West what the classical music had been flourishing or had been developed. And so like, for example, one of my dream actually with the classical archives together is to put music from China onto our what do you call repertoire, our collections.
Right.
Yeah, so that's that including traditional Chinese music and contemporary Chinese music. So the people will have a chance to explore that, and by the same token, we can add into our collection of Japanese music or contemporary music or symphonic music from different part of Asian countries. So I think that's very important, but also it's inevitable. I think the world is continue to become one. And I think the music will first can serve that function, because music, it doesn't need language to explain. We can just feel it. We can just perform it. People will understand what our good musics are.
That's wonderful. I think music is even more powerful than baseball.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. Wonderful. It's really,
possibly anyway.
Yeah.
So, well, I think maybe I should start getting this talk into production and move things along.
Okay, great.
But this is absolutely wonderful. And I can't,
so if there anything, when you edit anything, we need to, catch up, pick up something, then we can do another session, short session or something.
Yes, or a long session.
Yeah, or long session. Exactly. Okay, I think this is a really good platform. Yeah, I'm glad you're doing this. So maybe, time to time we can find out what we can do. We can add it to kind of a social point of view into the music world.
Absolutely.
And doesn't have to be just China. You can do anything. It's how the classical music take an important role in the social development.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Yeah. So that's I think people are interested though. So for example, like the German unification with Kurt Mazur.
Yes,
so that's a fascinating story.
Beethoven again.
Yes. Exactly. It's a really fascinating story, and also I think, for example, Soviet Union, and why Soviet Union really during their time, they tried to help the communist countries to build fine arts. Build up like all the communist countries, Vietnam, North Korea, Cuba, China, and many of those non-Western traditional countries. Soviet Union helped them to build opera houses, ballet theaters, and why is that? It's somehow I believe it's because any human being, we need inspiration. And we need faith. And I think colonialism brought lots of religion to those countries, right? And they didn't really care arts that much,
mm-hmm.
to my opinion, But Soviet Union, there's no religion, right? But you have to have something inspirational. So I think art is taking place in the religion in that sense. Yeah. So but this one you don't have to don't put this on. We have to really to have a kind of a logical discussion to see how they did, why they did it, and there must be cultural reason or social reason and political reason, whatever. Yeah, but there's a lot of things in classical world you can explore. It's very interesting. It's a cultural, what's called cultural history, right?
Cultural history.
Cultural history. Yeah. Okay.
Tremendous.